Welcome to Coming from Left Field, where we have conversations about politics, books, and current events with your host, Greg Godels and Pat Cummings. U.S. wars have profoundly altered the domestic political landscape, international influence, economic cycles, and structure of American society. One can study the impact of these conflicts from the point of view of historians, economists, sociologists, and psychologists. But perhaps the best summary of war is expressed in the 1970 number one Billboard hit by the musical group The Temptations. The lyrics? War. Huh. Yeah, what is it good for? Absolutely nothing. Our guest today is an expert on the causes of American wars. I'm not sure he would disagree with the Temptations. Let's discuss. Well, warm greetings. We are really excited, Greg and I, today to have Ivan Eland on today to talk about your wonderful new book, Domestic Causes of American War, Economic and Political Triggers. And I even took the extra care to spice up my green screen with your book cover on the back. So glad to have you here with us today. You're in the East Coast, right? Are you in Washington, D.C.?
Right, right. Well, I'm in Florida right now, but I go up to Washington. I used to live full time in Washington, but now I kind of split my time between Washington and Florida. So
Yeah.
I'm all on the East Coast, of course.
Well, let me give you a little background about you. You've worked for 4 decades in foreign policy, national security, presidential studies field, and you're a former national security analyst for Congress. You're Dr. Elan. You have a PhD in defense policy, MBA in business economics, BA in political science, and you're a prolific writer, multiple books. And I could go through all of the different publications you publish for, but you're really prolific in the field of working for the Center for Peace and Liberty. Tell us a little bit about the institute you work for, and if I got anything wrong with the introduction.
Yeah, I work for the Independent Institute in Oakland, California. I'm not physically located there, as I mentioned, but I was at one point. And I'm the director of the Center on Peace and Liberty, which basically is foreign policy, national security, and uh, civil liberties. And this is we stress the war's ill effects on civil liberties at home. That's one of our big issues, and that's part of the book. We show how the republic over the years has been degraded by, particularly in the 20th century and into the 21st, because of wars overseas. And you say, well, how does that work? Well, a lot of times, if you don't agree with the war, or it's a big war like World War I or World War II, everybody's expected to pitch in and do this. And so I saw that the market for accurate history of how we got into this wars, we always think of like a foreign threat, and that's the way it's always pitched. But there are a lot of domestic causes of wars, and many of these wars in U.S. history, if you really analyze it, it was less about national security and more about either economics or politicians either benefiting from the war or benefiting from delaying the war or whatever. So this is why I wrote the book, and this is what it's about. It's an unusual history of wars because it really, when you get done reading the book, you're probably going to say, "Wow, we got into a lot of wars in the U.S. that we really didn't need to get into for security reasons."
That's correct. And it's such a thorough book. I mean, with the footnotes and how you did the research. I mean, you really get that this is not this is a good historical chronology of what's gone on from our very first wars, the Barbary Wars, it's about 1780, and then going through the War of 1812. Mexican Wars, Civil Wars, all the way through the War on Terrorism, 9/11, and ending with the invasion of Iraq. I guess you could add your next chapter, what's going on with Ukraine and Gaza, but that's I think that the thesis that you put forth in this book would probably pertain to that equally as well. So,
Well, even
uh,
more so because I these are the major wars in U.S. history. All the
mhm.
other stuff is, gunboat diplomacy and uh, these sorts of things. Bombing boats of Venezuelan alleged Venezuelan drug dealers without due process. These types of things, or uh, uh, stealing the Panama Canal fair and square, as Senator Hayakawa once put it. Those types of episodes are minor, and so they're even more prone to domestic factors than the major wars are.
You make the case that these wars are pitched as national security questions, but you deny that, and I quite agree with that. I quite agree with much of what I read in your book, but maybe you could elaborate on what are the causes? I mean, what is it that generates? It's not national security. What's really generating the pitch for war? What's really causing the United States to be engaged in wars like the War of 1812, the Barbary Coast Wars, all the way through World War One, which was romanticized. Most of us have read in our high school history books, even collegiate history books, about these glorious wars and how we were a force for democracy in the world, et cetera, et cetera. You're saying essentially they weren't essential. You're essentially saying that these wars were not essential. What did cause these wars? What did generate the United States going to war in these cases?
Well, it varies as you go through U.S. history, but that hence the subtitle Economic and Political Triggers. But in general, at first, wars started out to protect U.S. commerce overseas. The quasi-war with France in 1798, the War of 1812, and that was part of the wars. But in the War of 1812 and I forgot to mention the Barbary pirates in the early 1800s, and then the War of 1812. And the first two, the quasi-war and the Barbary Wars, were to protect U.S. foreign commerce. Now, I'm a libertarian, so I feel that basically the Navy protects uh, vested economic interests even then, because it's regarded as a major uh, purpose of the Navy is to protect U.S. commerce. But of course, U.S. commerce overseas is risky. There are many things that can happen when ships go overseas, everything from hurricanes, storms, to pirates, etc. So this is even questionable from a libertarian standpoint. Those are probably the most justifiable wars that we've had, the first two. Then we get to War of 1812, which was also supposed to be the British were, because of the war in Europe against France, they were messing with our commerce a bit. But this has been going on for years. So the real reason for the War of 1812 was to grab Canada. That's the first thing they did in the American Revolution, was try to grab Canada. And the second thing, and the first thing in the War of 1812 was also to grab Canada. And they wanted to get Canada so they could bring Florida in because they needed a slave free balance at that point between slave states and free states. So we go to, then we get into this from the War of 1812 through really the Spanish-American War. It was for territorial expansion. The Mexican War, of course, was fought to grab the ports of California and also the Southwest secondarily, San Francisco in particular, protected port there. Then you get to the Spanish-American War, which was allegedly by McKinley the first humanitarian war. We were helping the Cuban rebels against the vile Spanish colonialists. But the problem is the rebels were as bad as the colonial oppressors. and they had better publicity. So, and that couple presidents before that war had avoided going into Cuba during the Spanish-American War, but we wanted to have some influence. Cuba had always been talked about as another state, but of course it was slave. They had a lot of slavery, and so the northern states weren't really too excited about that. So this was for economic reasons. They wanted to have a protectorate over Cuba, but they also, while they were at it, took a lot of Spanish colonies in the Pacific as well, Guam, Philippines, etc., in addition to Puerto Rico and the Caribbean. So this was a territorial expansion. Then you go up to the World War I. Again, we get to the commerce
Wait.
portion.
You go to the Civil Wars next.
Well, the Civil War is sort of I skipped that because, of course, it was to retain the southern states who wanted to secede over the slavery issue. And so this was part territorial, but it was also the main cause of the separation was slavery. And even in economics, the whole southern economy was based on slavery. And so there were actually territorial aspects to it, but the economic system, slavery was an economic system as well as a horrendous social system. And so these factors all played into that. And the question I have about the Civil War is, could we have done better by avoiding war? Because what happened with the South after the war was the South won the peace, and the North won the war, but the South won the peace. And we had 100 years of Jim Crow and Ku Klux Klan and everything else. And so the slaves may have been nominally freed, but as Martin Luther King himself said, we really didn't get rid of slavery until the 1960s during the Civil Rights Movement. So
your Civil War piece made me think differently because, first of all, I think everybody knows that at the beginning it wasn't about freeing the slaves. At the end, Lincoln,
right,
kind of threw that in. But one of your theses is we could have negotiated our way out of this. First of all, there weren't that many slaves freed, and it didn't do anything about the slaves in the North. It was it was a small percentage, and the devastation of the war probably could have had a better way that it could have been solved than by war. I don't know. Is that relatively accurate?
Yes, I think, and this most, if you look worldwide compared to what the U.S. did with how other countries freed their slaves, because there were many other countries that had slaves. Only I think Brazil and Cuba were later than the U.S. in freeing their slaves, and they did it by compensated emancipation. Now that's someone might in the modern world here might say, well, why would you pay slave owners because they have such a horrendous institution, why would you pay them to get rid of their slaves? Well, that's not an ideal situation, but killing 750,000 people, including 40,000 Union soldiers who were black and who were free, some of whom were free slaves, and having this bitterness, which we're still sort of fighting the Civil War today. It might have been better to do gradual compensation as it was done with the North, or if you wanted to do it quicker, compensated emancipation. But as you point out, and I say this in the book, Lincoln didn't. He was for compensated emancipation in the 1840s when he was a congressman, but he didn't take up this option until after the war had started. And then, of course, once the guns started shooting, even the border states were not enthusiastic about that outcome. But the reason that he didn't take that up was his goal was not to free the slaves at the beginning. His goal was to get the South back into the Union. and he did that by coercion. The South started the war by foolishly firing on Fort Sumter, but he could have done a more localized response. Instead, he went into a full-blown war, and this was a very, I think a mistake on his part.
That's it's a place where I have some differences, but I think going into counterfactual history doesn't help us much. And uh, for our listeners, our watchers, the important thing about your book is the overall thrust of it that locates war is not a national security issue for the most part, though it's sold that way, but a matter of expansion, a matter of economic interest, a matter of political interest, and so on. That's been the nature of our wars. And I think the lesson going forward, and the lesson I draw from your book, and I hope others will draw from your book, is that we should not be fooled to be drawn into wars for these false reasons that are other people's interest or other people's a direction we as a people don't want to go in. I think your chapter after the Civil War, uh, particularly about the Native Americans, is simply brilliant, and it just cuts to the chase and says it's an expansionist war. We just wanted the land, and to
Mhm.
get the land, we had to take it away from the people who lived on it. And I think there's so many commonalities with my political views and yours, even though you are a libertarian. I'd like to say this for some of our listeners too, who are not used to this Marxist finding common cause with libertarians. When I was a graduate student many years ago, I found myself in an office with another fellow who was called himself a conservative. And at that time, this was around the Nixon era when the scandals were coming out. I had little interest in Cold War liberals and less interest in corporate Republicans. So I was a little put off. It turned out he was a leader of Young Americans for Freedom. You're probably too young to remember that movement, but we talked, and he's a libertarian. We ended up having difficulty finding differences because what I find about libertarians are their principles. When I disagree with them, I disagree with them violently, but I respect principles. And most of the people that we deal with politically in America today have little or none. And so I welcome this book, and I think, in spite of some differences, we should discuss how you look at war. World War One, for example, it's if any war has ever been sold as a war for democracy, it was World War One, was it?
Well, no, it didn't make this. The war and the American people registered this after the war by, as we saw in the lead up to World War II with Hitler, who was a much more obvious threat than the Kaiser was in Germany in World War One. That the real reason that we got into it was we had a recession before the war, and the British started buying, the Europeans got into this war by dragging, they themselves, nobody wanted the war in Europe, unlike in Hitler's days when he was running all over Europe. None of the major powers really wanted wars, but they had made all these interlocking alliances that triggered this sort of, I don't want to use the term domino effect because that that's been discredited during the Cold War, but it certainly seemed like, these alliances caused everybody to get dragged into this war that nobody wanted. So the U.S. was sitting out there. It didn't get involved till about 3 years after the war started. And the reason was the U.S. economy became dependent on British war orders. And our economy was going really fast with false prosperity from this war. We were selling grain because they couldn't grow it during the war, and also armaments, of course. So this trade had to be protected, and the Germans, the British were trying to had what was called a hunger blockade. Their navy was dominant, and so they blockaded the entrances to the seas near Germany, and they were trying to starve Germany into submission. Well, the Germans came up with a cheap version of that because their navy was inferior. U-boats, submarines. They were trying to sink, so they put exclusion zones around France, Germany, right up in Ireland, and Britain and Italy, and to uh, hit this commerce coming in, trying to do the same thing to the British, impede their commerce. Well, of course, our part of that commerce was arms and agricultural products from the United States. And so Woodrow Wilson demanded that U.S. citizens had a right to travel on belligerent ships, that is, British ships or French ships that were carrying armaments through war zones. Now that's and Williams Jennings Bryan, who was his Secretary of State, resigned because he wasn't neutral in the war. He claimed to be neutral, but he was actually, we were helping one side or the other. And of course, we got dragged in eventually because of the loans and the exports that we were clearly on the British side, since we weren't trading much with Germany before the war or during the war.
National security interest in World War I for the United States.
Right, they should. If we would have stayed out of World War I, there may have been no Hitler because the Kaiser would have still been in power in Germany. Germany probably would have won the war in a 15-round decision rather than a knockout, which was added by U.S. troops. But also the World War I allies, if the Germans had known they were just about bankrupt, they would have continued the war and probably won it. But the U.S. came in with loans. So we had troops on the ground, which helped all these fresh troops. But the major help was we rescued the French and the British from bankruptcy with our lending at the end of the war. And that really turned the tables. And then, of course, that people, we look back on this. Why were we so reluctant? Now the history starts before World War II and say, well, we have to stop whatever threat it was, before the snowball gets rolling and rolling downhill. And we didn't in World War II because the people were just so isolationist. Well, one of the reasons they were isolationists was they were really mad about Wilson's elevated rhetoric that the war were going to make the world safe for democracy. And what it did was, Wilson knew this at the time, the British and the French merely used it to expand their empires, and people were bitter about that. And the casualty rates in World War I were higher than World War II because we were only there for really fighting in 6 months, and the deaths were just astronomical for the amount of the meat grinder was even worse than World War II as far as the rate of death for how long our troops were in. So the public was appalled, and that made them reluctant to get, even in 1940, after Hitler had overrun Norway and France, the U.S. public, mostly like 70-some%, 80% of the public still didn't want to get into World War II.
Right. Can we go back to this Civil War? Because one of the points of your book is that we go to war and we think we have certain reasons for doing so, and it turns out to be political reasons, economic reasons, not the reasons of taking a threat and getting rid of a threat. You mentioned that after we, quote, won the Civil War, that the South might have actually won the war. And that same theme is in Heather Cox Richardson's book on how the South won the Civil War. That, even though we ended up stopping slavery, that their particular political apparatus was strong and ran the South. Same thing as a Blackman's book, Slavery by Another Name. We get rid of slavery and we get convict leasing slavery, which could have been equal to, if not worse, up until the 1940s. And that's what I thought was so interesting about your book is you looked at history from a different perspective, from the repercussions of what caused these wars and the outcome of the wars, and it's often completely different than what we see in the history book. Did I get that kind of right?
Yeah, I mean, and to take the Civil War and World War II, both the iconic wars of history, I'm not saying that we weren't attacked at Pearl Harbor, and I'm not saying that slavery wasn't the main issue in Civil War. I'm just saying, these wars were more complex, both of them, than we're led to believe in our history books. And the part of the problem is, well, for instance, we're in the public mind, the North fought the Civil War to free the slaves, and that was why it was fought. Whereas, of course, that wasn't, as you pointed out earlier, that wasn't the purpose. When it started out, that was the effect that at least the slaves were nominally free for a few years. But then the South said, well, let them come. The U.S. Army went back to a small size, and unless they were prepared to occupy the South for decades after that war with significant forces, which they weren't. We had a recession in 1873, which really sort of ended Reconstruction. Reconstruction was northern troops in the South, and by 1876, it was completely over with. So then the South just went back to its merry ways. They couldn't have formal slavery, so they, as I mentioned in those two books, both of which I've read, it was a neo-slavery type of situation. In World War II, people were saying, well, Hitler was murdering Jews and we had to save the Jews. Many people think that, but of course, that's not why we went to World War II. And the Holocaust didn't start till 1942, after we had already entered the war. Now, of course, there was lots of anti-Jewish things going on in Germany, but the mass slaughter of 6 million Jews didn't happen until the U.S. Army detected in 1942. So this was not, and then Roosevelt, the Jewish leaders went to Roosevelt and said, hey, listen, let's bomb the tracks to Auschwitz. And he said, no, we've got other targets that we have to hit. So, these types of things. And also, at the time, the U.S. was not taking in Jews to a great extent, increasing the quotas of immigration into the United States, because there was a Great Depression. And so this was, they turned away the St. Louis, which was carrying Jewish refugees from Europe. So this is not this idea that certainly Hitler had to be defeated, but this idea that, and in the Pacific, it's even more iffy. But even the Great War of World War II, which I think everybody sort of say was a righteous war, the problem was that it was slightly less righteous than it's made out to be.
Tell us about the provocation for Japan to bomb Pearl Harbor. People, I think, don't know this. They don't know the economic squeeze that was placed on Japan.
Yeah. So Japan was, colonizing militarily. So they were certainly not blameless, but they got bogged down in China. The war in the Pacific is really over China. And what happened was the U.S. was trying to get Japan to withdraw from China. And there were other options that Roosevelt could have pursued, like getting more arms to the Chinese to fight off the Japanese, to give the Japanese an even bigger quagmire. But of course, then they Japanese went into Indonesia, probably biting off more than they could chew. But so the U.S. decides that it's going to put an embargo on oil. Well, at the time, we were the major oil producer, and the Japanese really couldn't buy it from the Dutch, and the British also had oil companies, but they were worried about Japanese colonization too. So the U.S. decides that it's going to, start monkeying with oil supplies. Now, what really happened was U.S. The Assistant Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, at the time, FDR was, they were thinking about an oil embargo against Japan, and apparently it wasn't FDR's intention to cut off all oil, because he knew that would mean war with Japan. But Acheson cut off all oil, and FDR didn't countermand that order. So now when they cut off the oil to Japan, that the only other option that the Japanese had was to attack Indonesia. And the problem with them attacking Indonesia is it goes right by the Philippines, which is on the Japanese supply line, goes right by a U.S. base. I mean, U.S. colony was still, Philippines were still a colony until 1947. So the Japanese said, well, we can't have a colony there with our supply lines at risk because we got to get this oil from Indonesia. So they were very desperate, and they ended up attacking Pearl Harbor. And Yamamoto, the admiral in charge, thought this is not a good idea, but he got outvoted by the army. General Tojo, who was then first of all, the Japanese government fell when FDR wouldn't negotiate with it, and the more hardline Tojo took over as prime minister, who was a general. And so they decided that they had to attack to back the U.S. down and hopefully increase their defense perimeter before the U.S. counterattack. Or some of them hoped that this would scare the U.S. that the U.S. wouldn't really fight, and of course that was a bad bet. And so this war did have a provocation in the Pacific.
The other thing that I think is interesting about your book is how the false equivalency of just the death counts, for example. Our firebombing in Second World War was probably more problematic than the dropping the atomic bomb. I mean, the way in which we conducted the war. This was especially apparent in the Korean War. The literal devastation that we did to Korea was just remarkable, and it's war crimes by any other reference. Tell me about this just body count issue and how that's used and manipulated for political reasons.
Well, we had been bombing both German and Japanese cities, and the British more accurately termed it in Germany terror bombing. And what that was doing was trying to get the Germans to surrender and then the Japanese to surrender by bombing civilians. And we were doing it with conventional bombing. And these firebombing is what we were using. And one of the reasons that we used it in Japan was because the houses were made of wood and paper, and we knew if they bombed Tokyo or the big German or Japanese cities, that the whole town would burn down, right? And which is what happened. And so we were already doing this firebombing in Germany and Japan. Now, this strategic bombing. The U.S. government itself, after the war, did the strategic bombing survey and said, well, it actually made the Germans fight harder because when you start killing civilians, it motivates the other side to say, listen, they're killing innocent people here. That's not fair, so we're going to fight harder. Well, in Japan, we're already under FDR, both the German and the Japanese theaters, we were doing this firebombing. Hamburg and Dresden in Germany, and then most of the big Japanese cities include. More people died in the Tokyo firebombings, which were done with many planes and many raids, than the two atomic bombs that were dropped. But the atomic bomb was such was a more efficient way of killing tens of thousands of civilians than the firebombing. But so it was just a case of becoming more efficient. Now, of course, the atomic bomb did open the atomic age, and if there was one saving grace, and there wasn't really for killing that many civilians with anything. They could have done it on a demonstration island or something else, but it did demonstrate how powerful the weapons were. And of course now they make those look like pop guns. The
Right.
ones we have megatonnage nuclear warheads now when it's kilotons back then. And that may not mean much to the average person, but they're much more powerful. So the atomic bombs, the two atomic bombs did open the atomic age. But as far as killing numbers of people, the fire bombings were even worse than the atomic bombings.
Since the Spanish-American War and even before, we've had essentially a two-party system, and around the wars from that period on, it's been pretty much bipartisanship about these war policies. Where does that leave the American people?
Well, I think the reason for this is our reading of history starts with in the Depression years and says, well, we let Hitler. Some people say, we should have stayed in Europe after World War II, World War I, or we wouldn't have had Hitler, a problem. And that's a misreading of history because as I pointed out earlier, World War I was a really key war because it told the American people that this was nonsense. There was a lot of opposition in the 1930s of what happened in World War I. The U.S. shouldn't have gotten into it, and it led to World War II. Hitler came to power because our allies rubbed Germany's nose in it, and also Woodrow Wilson demanded that the Kaiser abdicate, which of course opened the way for Hitler. So World War I and World War II have to be taken as a pair, I think. And these types of this idea that history started with World War II is just not true. And we shouldn't have gone into World War I, probably wouldn't have had World War II. But what the narrative of both parties has been that, well, we slept while Hitler rose in Europe. We didn't do anything about it until too late. So therefore, we have to have a global policy of, well, in the First World, we're getting up to the Cold War. That colored our Cold War mentality, where we had the Truman Doctrine, where wherever there was a hint of left-leaning governments coming in or a left-leaning guerrilla group, we had to help that country. And so this was a global containment policy. And this was driven by this narrative of history that we have to stop any threat before it snowballs into a future Hitler. Everybody, and if you notice in like Iraq, Milosevic in Serbia, who we had a war with, Saddam Hussein, who we had two wars with in the Persian Gulf, the presidents at the time compared them to Hitler. And of course, they weren't anywhere near as powerful as Hitler or threatening to take over an entire continent. But this is the mentality. And so we wanted to reshape the world in our own image after World War II. And we had 50% of the GDP in the world. All the other countries were devastated. Well, the great powers at least were devastated by World War II. And so we did it because we could, not because we should have. And this is why we have this bipartisan foreign policy up until I would say, the fiascos in Afghanistan and Iraq had the same effect as Vietnam. We pulled back a little bit because of those wars. Of course, we should have learned from Vietnam not to do it in Afghanistan and the invasion of Iraq. But this type of thing, and I think now we're seeing a little bit of a pullback, at least on the part of Trump. But he's still is very belligerent in his rhetoric and that sort of thing. But I think we still have the continuing problem that both parties buy into this. The U.S. should be able to do anything, and the wars after World War II, I think, were mainly caused by we were talking about commerce first and territorial expansion, and I think after World War II. We're talking about the military-industrial congressional complex. We didn't have a permanent defense industry, and I think this is a very important point, until World War II, because in previous wars, the U.S. factories converted to war production and then converted back to the commercial production, and also the army shrunk. Well, in World War II, we had 44% of our GDP was in warfare, and at the end of the war, lots of places, like particularly suburban areas, exurban areas, rural areas, even had defense production, had to spread all over the country because of the volume of stuff that we needed to fight in two major theaters at the same time, which of course the US military didn't want, but FDR, that's where we ended up in World War II. So we needed this vast production. And so at the end of the war, people lobbied, different geographic locations lobbied to keep defense spending high. And then, of course, North Korea invaded South Korea 5 years after World War II ended, and that allowed us to have start having the first large peacetime military in U.S. history, because this was not a traditional thing that the U.S. did. It always demobilized after wars. So now we have the military-industrial complex and the large peacetime army to supply, and this has been interventionist. Both parties, their districts and states make money off this, and it's sort of false prosperity. It would be better if they got rid of it, because the defense industry is very inefficient and went to commercial production, producing consumer goods or anything but weapons.
I think that was the best part of your book, is describing that. First of all, the military industrial complex, you call it the military industrial congressional complex,
Yeah.
which I think is important. And it, especially in the Afghanistan war, it was the vast majority of the money we spent went to a handful of defense firms in Washington, D.C. area. And it is sold as this big threat. All it is just a money transfer to the powerful interest manipulating their congressional candidates for their own benefit. I don't know.
You mentioned it's MICC with Ivan. It's not just MIC. And many of us on the left are familiar with military-industrial complex. It's a theme, but I was struck by why it's the MICC. Maybe you could elaborate on why you put congressional in that, Ivan.
Yeah, well, it's the old. Some people in political science, they call it the iron triangle, and it doesn't just pertain to defense, but defense is the most famous example of it. What you have is the bureaucracy, whatever bureaucracy is. The military bureaucracy is very powerful, since we have all these images of when people die in wars, the military gets a certain prestige, and we say, well, you can dispute the war, but you still have to support the military, so that's the bureaucracy. Then you have the military industrial, the dedicated defense industry from World War II. Again, that's when it started. And they don't produce much commercially anymore. They can't convert like they used to from commercial to military and then back to commercial after the war is over. They have to be subsidized, and it's a very cloistered industry, and the government keeps it that way. They have they say they have competition, but they have a lot of sole source contracts, cozy deals between the government and the industry. And of course, the third one, as you mentioned, Congress. All these industries are in congressional districts and states, and that causes the Congress people in both parties to buy into this. And of course, more interventions overseas mean more replacement equipment for stuff that's burned up in the conflicts, which has more of an economic effect in these congressional districts and states. So you have all three points of this triangle supporting more military, higher military budgets. And even when the Cold War was over, well, the defense budget went down a little bit, but then they started dreaming up new threats to, to counter. And then, of course, 9/11 happened. And here's a really telling fact that you can tell that the military-industrial congressional complex was operating, because after 9/11, finding and killing terrorists requires intelligence and either special forces or precision strikes. You don't need a whole lot of new equipment, but of course, they used the 9/11 threat to build weapons that were designed for to use against a peer competitor that didn't exist at the time. China hadn't risen yet to where it was as big an issue as it is now. And so they manufactured threats. And of course, we can go back to the Cold War, and even Dean Acheson, who then became Secretary of State after World War II, he even said we made the threats more real than I forget what his exact quote was, but it was a way of saying, well, we lied about the threat, we exaggerated the threat. And then Senator Vandenberg told Harry Truman, you got to scare the hell out of the American people about the Soviet Union and its expansion is going to take over the world or whatever. And so during the Cold War, the threat was magnified as well. So, and this is a continued, they found how to do that, and they're doing so now, I believe, with China at the current time.
Right. I kind of screwed up in this interview because, like I said, the best part about the book was that the Cold War, 9/11 invasion, but I've got to get your opinion about what's going on with the Gaza situation and the Trump negotiation to finally just said, we got to stop this, and all of a sudden the war stops. And what's interesting to me is that this is a situation that could have been resolved so much earlier. We want the hostages back, and so it was resolved through negotiation and not through the devastation that occurred with the destruction of Gaza. Tell me about your thoughts about that in light of your theses of this book.
Well, on my own view about this is, this conflict has been going on since 1948, and it's about land again. And we get the Israeli side of it here, but there's the Arab side is equally important. And Trump saying that he wants to get rid of the Palestinian people and have them move to the other countries so he can build resorts and stuff. I mean, that's like waving a red flag before a bull, because the Palestinians have been displaced twice, by the 1948 war and by the 1967 war, in Israel proper, and then in the West Bank and other areas in 1967. So in this particular case, I'm not sure Biden warned Bibi Netanyahu, don't do what we did after 9/11, meaning go hog wild. And of course, it's in Bibi Netanyahu's personal interest to do that, so he can keep his governing coalition together, so he can stay in office, so he can stay out of jail. And I don't think what he did was really helpful to Israel either, because he's made generations of Palestinians want to fight rather than negotiate, because they killed massive amounts of civilians. There's this tough guy mentality. Oh, we're just going to let the guns go. These people are all evil, blah, blah, blah. Well, in counterinsurgency and counterterrorism, a smart military doesn't do that, because it makes the enemy fight harder when you start killing civilians. You try to do it surgically, and that's probably what they should have done to try to kill the Hamas leaders if they wanted to retaliate for the October 7th attacks, and called it a day, or take bit more defense measures in southern Israel. That's what they should have done. But of course, that wasn't in the This is a classic example. This is not a U.S. example. It's a classic example of the politicians' interests coming over the country's interests. And that's happened countless times in U.S. history. So you'll see in the book, but in this case, it happened in Israel. And of course, the U.S. has taken a part of this by selling all the weapons. They should have cut off the weapons to Israel. I mean, I was really enraged today. The National Review put out a piece saying, well, you know, this is a win for civilization, meaning that Arabs aren't part of civilization. And killing almost 68,000 people, and it's probably at least another 10,000 higher the people they can't find in the rubble. And of course, hitting 92% of the residential buildings in Gaza. Where are these people going to live? There's going to be in tent camps for decades after this, and it's just over the top, and it is very questionable under international law what Bibi Netanyahu has done
Right.
here, and I hope he gets the justice, because these are war crimes, they're crimes against humanity, and it's probably genocide, all of it there. And the initial attack was a terrorist attack, and that's what we have to call it. My definition is very simple of a terrorist attack. If you're purposely killing civilians to achieve political ends, doesn't matter who does it. Doesn't matter if you do it with atomic bombs on Japan, with firebombing of Dresden and Hamburg, and the Israelis have committed terrorism as well on a grander scale. So I just, I think both sides are at fault. Well, the Hamas and the Israeli government are at fault. The people that got in the way are the hostages who had no fault, the Israeli hostages, and also the 68,000, well, let's try all the millions of people who live in Gaza, because they all had tremendous effects. And I just think an over the top response was the Israeli military said a year ago that all the military objectives were achieved, and so they engaged in over the top response. So that's my view, and it's kind of an unvarnished view, but I just don't know how you can say that contributed to the advancement of civilization by doing that. This just thought it's just not. It's very disappointing.
You have to be very careful with the body count. That couple thousand Israelis were killed at the music festival. You said 50, it's 50 to 100,000 civilians were killed in response. Greg and I are trying to get authors of the Lancet article in September that said the global health estimated that our American sanctions kill on an average of 564,000 people a year. Our sanctions do, our policy.
Right. Well, that's
When you're
another, yes, yes.
you're getting into this body count stuff. I mean, be careful when you're pointing your finger, at other people. Greg, let's wrap things up. How about some more praise for Ivan's book and
Oh, I'm
how
effusive with
remarkably
praise.
how remarkably good
You're
this
getting,
book
this is
is?
the only Marxist endorsement you probably have ever gotten, but I think your book is, I will disagree on the Soviet Union, we'll disagree on the Civil War, but in general, the thesis that runs through this book about a
Consistent.
false reasons for going to war. I mean, the really deplorable reasons for going to war we share. And I think everyone should read your book. It's thoughtful. And even where I disagree, it's thoughtful. So I really appreciate you coming on and sharing it. And I hope it gets in the hands of many, many, many people.
Yeah, well, foreign policy is less of a partisan issue than other issues, I think, and you can find agreement on the left and right, and on the interventionist side, but there's also agreement on the non-interventionist side among left and right. So it doesn't split down the middle in foreign
Yeah.
policy.
I can't praise it enough, and it's just it made me think differently when I finished the book. I love having my mind changed, and you truly did change my mind and gave me a lot more respect for parts of your libertarian beliefs, which I think I share, and you've helped indoctrinate me to those, and I thank you for that very much. So,
Well,
All
thanks for
right.
having me on. I appreciate it.
Good, good. Very good. Thank you. Appreciate it.